Welcome back to The Business of Wellness. This is the podcast that deep dives into anything and everything at the intersection of nutrition science and business, politics, media, and culture. I'm your host, Jaclyn London. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition expert, and I am so happy to be back with you guys. If you are a new listener, welcome. I am thrilled that you're here. If you have been here for a while and are wondering what happened, where'd we go? What went on here? I'm back. I have a 1-year-old. It's a little hard to record. I think you might get some of the background noise in today's episode, but we're doing the best we can. We got to bring the content to the people, and I could not wait on this episode any longer. A little fun fact for you guys is that this is actually the third time I've recorded this episode. So I feel like we really need to get started with talking about, from the practitioner standpoint, but also from a business standpoint, what RFK Jr. and the MAHA movement are getting right and what they're getting wrong about American food, nutrition, and health. What we need to know about it, what health practitioners specifically need to know about it, and where there are some great points to be made and where there's some major red flags that have come up as a result. So I'm thrilled to be here with you guys. I have missed you all. I am excited to get this started again and to actually talk about some of the more topical and relevant things that are going on in our midst in the food, nutrition, and health space. I also want to make sure that you all know that those of you who are returning listeners are going to hear those interview episodes that we typically do on this podcast. I'm also going to be releasing these throughout the next couple of weeks, and we're going to continue with this specific series, which is a series focused on the MAHA movement and on some of the core principles that are being put out there, some of the policy ideas and high-level concepts that have been put out there by RFK Jr., whether he is confirmed or not, which honestly, let's face it, it looks like he's getting confirmed. This will kind of be like a continuation, an ongoing component of the Business of Wellness podcast. I am going to continue to cover a number of different MAHA related topics over the next couple of weeks in episodic format. So this is the first of a number of episodes. Let's see how far we go. It's just no shortage of content on the topic of MAHA. There are so many interesting influencers in the MAHA space. I think we deserve to do one full episode on who is comprising the MAHA movement and what are their backgrounds and what makes them qualified to speak about American health. But that's for another day. Today, we're just going to set the table. I want to give you a lay of the land of what is happening in the MAHA sphere, a background and overview about a little bit about me. Why am I qualified to speak on this topic in the first place? Why do I have a unique and particular perspective that I think you're going to want to hear? I don't think you're going to hear it anywhere else, honestly. And then we're going to get into some of the stated objectives of MAHA as it relates to food and nutrition. I'm going to talk more in depth today about two specific areas. One of those is food additives, and the other one is the topic of the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for Americans, of which the next Dietary Guidelines is meant to be published at the end of this year, at the end of 2025. In the series at large, we are going to tackle the specific science-based topics individually. Some of the more popularized topics like the use of conventional pesticides on American-grown food, the role of industry in making public health recommendations. You'll hear most of that part today. What it would take to get Americans healthier and how we could do so in a way that would bring in more private interest and incentivize corporations to make changes to their unique products and services that actually benefit Americans. We're going to get into all of it. I also want to make sure that I tackle your questions. But in order to do that, I need your submissions. So as a question comes up, as you're listening to this episode, all I am going to ask of you is to think about what you want to hear more about as it relates to MAHA. I need to hear from you guys. What do you think? Do you like the podcast? Are you enjoying this series? What do you think about MAHA in general? What are your questions for me about MAHA? I have to hear from you in order to deliver the content that you all want to listen to. So please go ahead, leave a 5-star rating. Just start there. Just see how it feels. Wherever you're listening to this right now, leave a 5-star rating and share a review. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you can't stand. I want to hear all of it. Leave it for me wherever you're listening to this right now. And that way you can share your questions there as well. And then we have somewhere to start. We're going to, again, go into the stated objectives of MAHA as it relates to food and nutrition. I'm going to conclude by giving you 3 of the biggest things that I think RFK and the MAHA movement and its acolytes and allies, as well as its opponents, are getting massively, deeply wrong about food, nutrition, and health in America. Let's get started. Let me give you a little bit of context to get started. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm just going to give you a brief bio. If you're here for the first time, welcome. I could not be more excited to have you. Again, I am Jaclyn London. I'm a registered dietitian, author, podcast host, of course, a consultant, and a media spokesperson. I am probably best known by many of you listening for my nutrition myth busting content on social media, which actually started since I became a dietitian throughout my career, but especially through the context of my book. That's when this whole myth busting platform really flourished for me, which is called Dressing on the Side and Other Diet Myths Debunked: 11 Science-Based Ways to Eat More, Stress Less, and Feel Great About Your Body. I've worn many hats in my career, but I've previously held leadership roles for consumer brands as head of nutrition and wellness at Weight Watchers and nutrition director at Good Housekeeping. And today I bring my extensive experience in clinical research and clinical nutrition and private practice, media, the corporate world, to my work as a consultant, helping brands, investors, startups, nonprofits, you name it, to build practical, accessible, and science-based nutrition and wellness solutions that meaningfully impact consumers and help them live healthier lives. So that's really at the core of all that I do, of all of the work that I've done over the course of my career and what I continue to do today. On a personal level, I am going to admit something that I don't really talk about very much, but it's why I think my voice in this MAHA conversation is needed. So my personal politics lean center right. And for where I live, which is New York City, and for the spaces in which I have worked and spent time, so like, let's just say elite universities and media, and for a publicly traded company, that has not been something I've ever felt comfortable sharing. In some cases, you could even argue that we have seen plenty of examples over the past few years that even saying that you're a centrist in whatever capacity or that you lean right on certain issues has gotten you truly canceled. I mean, it's been at the center of cancellations across the media landscape. So you can understand where that concern comes from. But the truth is, working for yourself, you have nothing to lose. Like, my values are on the table. When it comes to science and when it comes to my understanding of science communication, I really have the ability to see where there are some blind spots within the scientific community that are politically motivated, even when I don't think that that's the initial intention. I think a lot of people go in, especially in scientific professions, in helping professions, with the intention purely of helping people. And sometimes we don't even realize when political messaging or political narratives are weaving their way into whatever it is that we are talking about, counseling about, thinking about, working within. So I want to call that out at the top of this, because I have this perspective. My dad was a conservative who was highly influential in the first Trump administration, including part of the staffing of the first administration, and was influential as it relates to the Abraham Accords and a lot of what went on in the Middle East during the administration. And on the other hand, I grew up in the West Village. I attended a private school that was truly, I mean, if you know anything about the Little Red Schoolhouse, like it is one of the most left-leaning institutions that you can possibly find. It's hard to say that I am just a centrist or a right-leaning type of person. It's really more about where the places in which I've spent time, the people with whom I've spent time. I know a lot of people that disagree with me. I am comfortable disagreeing with other people. I think, honestly, what I have found across the board that never ceases to surprise me. We have way more in common than what separates us. I think we lose sight of that in this country because we're always talking about how divided we are, when in fact we are much less divided than we think. We actually think in many of the same ways and have many of the same views. It's just often that we have different approaches to how we go about solving problems in the United States. I would go into more detail on all of this, and if you're interested, please feel free to ask. Again, leave this for me in the comments, but I really feel like our time is going to be best served by getting into the meat of things as it relates to MAHA. My point in sharing any of these anecdotes about my own political leanings with you is that because of my background, because of the current industry in which I operate, and because of present day politics, I'm informed on both sides. I understand both sides of the Kennedy debate, and I certainly understand nutrition science and, of course, the business of wellness, which is why you're here in the first place, right? So I'm sharing all of this with you as someone who is very much eager for RFK Jr. to be successful if he's confirmed, and for MAHA to be a thriving movement that lasts for decades. I just am highly skeptical of it because of the scientific reality of what's being discussed and the questionable influences in particular that are affecting RFK Jr.'s position on many different topics. And I think those are really relevant to call out and discuss and just have this open forum for me to speak to you about. And then for me to hear about from you and to hear about what you think about all of it and what your take on it all is. The main takeaway that I want you to have after all of this is that replacing our current corporate capture of scientific institutions with another version of corporate capture is not a solution. It's a Band-Aid at best. And ultimately, it's dangerous at worst. It means that if you're in favor of everything related to MAHA that's been out there so far, it can still be undone in 4 years, at least based on what I've heard, right? It can still be undone in 4 years. You need to remember that. I think we all would do well to really remember that. And if you're against MAHA, well, then I think the time is really now to consider what you would want to replace some of the ideologies, some of the policy concepts that have been discussed so far with. What would you want to replace it with? The main question I want you to ask yourself as you listen to this episode and to this entire series is, who do you think should profit from Americans getting healthier? And who should be empowered to help us get there? Who are the best qualified people to help us get there? Let's get into the stated nutrition policies of MAHA. The Make America Healthy Again MAHA movement centers around its advocacy of several core objectives. So let me just give you an outline of their primary stated goals. We don't have very much detail quite yet, but we do have what we can piece together both from what's out there on MAHA and from what RFK Jr. has stated himself. First is encouraging transparency in food production. I could not be more in favor of this. I think transparency is truly something that I believe is the secret ingredient of the food industry's, potential. What is the next phase of the food industry, and how do we cultivate a better relationship between the people that produce food and the people that consume food, which is, truly everyone. In fact, it's every single day that the people that produce food also have to consume it. So, I really think that we have a major gap between the people that produce food and the people that consume it. And I think we need to start bridging that gap. And the best way to do that is through transparency. There's also, something that he has stated, that RFK Jr. has stated, and that the MAHA movement has stated publicly, and I believe is still available on their website, is promoting natural and organic foods. Now, many of you may be listening to this and thinking, one of those has a definition, right? USDA organic has a definition. Natural is basically what people think it is. It's completely undefined. There's been attempts over the years, particularly in recent years, to define the term natural on food labels. And yet we have yet to come to an actual definition. And the FDA actually backed off of providing a definition for this because there's just too many special interest groups that play a role in this. And basically, if I had to add in an additional theme of this series, it's going to be special interest groups and the role of lobbying in the food industry and the wellness industry and the unique space in which RFK Jr. is currently operating, which is a little bit of both. I really did not quite understand until 2024 just how big of a role lobbying plays in everything. It is truly of utmost importance that we all have a clear understanding of the role of lobbying in food. There's also his stated, and MAHA stated, the objective of challenging big food and big pharma. So MAHA often criticizes large corporations in food and pharma for their roles in public health problems rather than speaking about solving public health issues. I think there's a lot of two things can be true at once happening in that. But I think what we've heard publicly is mostly negatives from RFK Jr. about big food and big pharma and the promotion of processed foods and the promotion of medications and the ways in which these things contribute to chronic disease. There's also empowerment of consumer advocacy. I love this. I think this is fantastic. Movement seeks to educate and mobilize people to demand higher quality food products and to advocate for regulatory changes in the food system, all of which I think we need to do. I think where I probably disagree with this is the what. What do we need to change specifically? It's a question of what we focus on. Then there is improving public health through food reform. MAHA connects dietary changes to larger public health outcomes, positioning their goals as part of a broader strategy to combat obesity, diabetes, and other diet-related diseases. That's an important one. Again, we all know, and likely those of us who are listening to this right now know that food is truly at the center of everything, and in so many ways. It's certainly excellent to hear someone with such a large public platform be able to elevate that message and that story. There's also the demand for corporate accountability. And I think this is hugely important too. MAHA campaigns for stricter regulations around accountability for food companies regarding the nutritional value of their products, their marketing practices, and especially those targeting children. I feel like I'm hearing too much about ingredients as it relates to children and not enough about marketing. And we're going to do a whole episode on that. I also want to give a particular shout out to Kennedy's position on and role in the Dietary Guidelines for America. Kennedy argues that existing dietary guidelines contribute to health issues by promoting the consumption of carbohydrates and limiting saturated fat. And he believes that these recommendations have led to increased rates of obesity and chronic disease. He's been all over the media stating these things as fact, when in fact we know that less than 10% of Americans are actually following the dietary guidelines to begin with. We're going to come back to this. Kennedy's advocated for more incorporation, greater incorporation of real whole foods. This is something that everyone in the health community can get on board with. We all agree with this. We all want Americans to be eating more real whole foods, cooking at home more, choosing less processed foods in their dietary patterns. Kennedy has suggested that the guidelines do not adequately promote these options, and he read the dietary guidelines and feeling quite entrenched in their unique ins and outs, the definition of certain things, that the process by which the dietary guidelines comes to be. I would say that there is quite a bit. There's in fact only speak about real whole foods in the actual content of the dietary guidelines. It's really about how they're applied, and we will get into that as well. He has also questioned the role of dietary fat. He's challenged the limitations placed on saturated fat in the guidelines, advocating for their inclusion based on recent scientific studies to question the link between saturated fat intake and heart disease. I don't know about those scientific studies questioning the link between saturated fat intake and heart disease, but we'll come back to that. The next dietary guidelines is 2025. So we're here. It's happening by the end of the year. As Secretary of HHS, Kennedy will actually have the opportunity to influence these guidelines significantly on one hand. On the other hand, I am actually not sure about that. I see one glaring place that he could make a profound impact, and I'll get to that in just a sec. The other thing that Kennedy has talked about as it relates to food and nutrition would be high fructose corn syrup. He's expressed concerns about the unique nature of HFCS, which if you know anything about nutrition, you know that it's not all that unique. It's just the foods in which it's consumed makes it that much easier to consume excess sugar. He's also spoken very vociferously about artificial food dyes. So Kennedy's criticized the use of these food dyes in ultra-processed packaged foods, particularly cereal like Fruit Loops, suggesting that they have adverse effects on children's health, including hyperactivity. He's also called for a ban on food dyes and highlighted the differences in food formulation between the US and other countries, noting that some additives allowed domestically are banned elsewhere. Now, I would say that if there is the single greatest myth of our time, it is the idea that the US has less strict standards about food additives than other countries. We simply allow different things here, and different countries around the world allow other things. There are more color additives that are permitted for use in the European Union than in the United States. But when you look this up just as a quick Google search, or you go to ChatGPT, you can't find that. You really have to know where to look. You have to be on PubMed, as I have been deep diving on all of this. And actually, just to go on a quick tangent for you guys for a second, the whole reason why I decided to even record this episode in the first place, this started as a discussion about food additives after presenting at Culinary Nutrition Collaborative. My friends who run this conference, I presented over the summer and prepared a full-blown presentation on this topic and wound up just getting kind of obsessed with the topic itself and why there is such a discrepancy between what the research shows and what the media narrative has been. And a huge part of it is that certain things that have been search optimized as like foods banned in other countries but allowed in the US are leading the information war on this topic when it's in fact not true. In other words, someone who wrote an article with an opinion about food additives has that as like their headline, and therefore articles that have that headline have led the coverage versus actually looking at the research, and not just research, looking at regulatory policy, which is transparent. Like you can find which food additives are permitted in the US by looking on the FDA website, and you can find what's permitted in Europe by looking at EFSA, EFSA, European Food Safety Authority's website, and looking at what's permitted. All you have to do is just dive in to what's allowed. And yes, it's dense and it's not fun to look at, but that is supposed to be the job of a journalist, isn't it? Right? It's to actually look at what's allowed versus what's not. So this drives me nuts. The other thing, use of seed oils in food products, targeting canola, sunflower, and corn oil, claiming that they contribute to health problems like obesity and inflammation. He has advocated for beef tallow in food preparation, particularly at fast food establishments like McDonald's. Ultra-processed food. Kennedy's been a strong advocate against the consumption of ultra-processed foods, linking them to chronic disease like obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, and has proposed policy changes to limit their availability in school and federal nutrition programs, aiming to improve public health outcomes. Now, this is where I think things get more interesting. There's one place that I personally believe, even as someone with some conservative-leaning fiscal tendencies, I think that if there's one investment that we could make that would truly garner bipartisan support, it would be toward to anything that helps kids, especially as it relates to food and nutrition. The kids that our food, the the food that our kids eat is of utmost importance. And I know that better than most. And I'm sure many of you listening agree with that. I think we should definitely be looking at things that target kids and certainly that target parents as well, to make sure that we are focused on the right things and spending our money in the right places at the federal level. Kennedy has also expressed interest in dietary supplements. And this is another area where I start to get worried. Expressed some really strong support for dietary supplements, criticizing the FDA for what he perceives as their suppression of these products. In October 2024, he stated that the FDA's actions against supplements and other health-related products were detrimental to public health, indicating his intention to reform such regulatory practices. I find this confusing because, does he know how much supplements cost? I mean, in many cases, your copay for a medication is going to be lower than a dietary supplement. Not that I want you to be on a medication, but you know what I'm saying? It's not quite like one is the good guy and one is the bad guy here. And in many ways, I would argue that if there is a good guy and a bad guy, you could make many more cases for why the wellness industry, big supplement, is much worse than big pharma. Let's get into what everyone, ranging from MAHA and politicians to independent conservative media, as well as mainstream media, is getting wrong about Kennedy's core areas of focus in food, nutrition, and wellness. So the first thing is a topic I just mentioned before, which is most of what's being reported as ingredients banned in other countries but allowed in the United States is simply false. Okay, let me just say that again. Most of the ingredients, the food additives that are quote unquote banned in other countries, but allowed by our United States food system and the policymakers that have gotten us here, this is a false statement. American health is not in decline because of food additives. How do I know this to be true? Let me actually make a business case before I make a science case. In 2015, 3 of the largest U.S. food companies, General Mills, Nestle, and Kraft, removed artificial ingredients in most, if not all, of their products. In some cases, it was all. General Mills, for example, now holds the largest market share in breakfast cereal versus Kellogg's since this formulation change was made. That was 2015 into 2016. And yet, in 2025, the health of Americans continues to decline. More than half of U.S. adults are living with at least one chronic condition. Nearly half of Americans have at least one risk factor for heart disease. Type 2 diabetes in Americans under 20 years old is rising. If removing food additives from ultra-processed packaged foods were going to be the thing that made the biggest change to helping ultra-processed foods become more like just processed foods, to make them less ultra and more like food, it would be working by now. We would have seen some outcomes by now if that was going to be the thing that was the catalyst for other things, for other changes to be made. Because I don't even know that everyone in the MAHA movement is even saying that food additives are the problem. Or if the removal of food additives from US-made food products was an issue, then at scale, we should be seeing some turnaround from rising rates of chronic disease, from the prevalence of chronic disease, but we're not. We're seeing it go up. In real life, in 2025, these ingredients are not actually banned around the world. Many of them are under a different naming convention versus how we typically name food additives in the US. The other thing to know is that food dyes and other additives that are being labeled as harmful, quote unquote, in the EU are not labeled for scientific reasons. They're not labeled because of a health risk. They're labeled because of political pressure and lobbying in those respective countries. We see this at home. We see this abroad. I don't know why we're at all surprised by it. I was speaking to a friend, was mentioning how many things in our education system are still in effect because of No Child Left Behind, which I want to say, I think that was 2000 that policy was enacted. There's so many things that still play a role in our everyday lives. And I think we would do well to remember that. Political pressure, politically motivated, not evidence-based. People can still be eating more food dye in the United States, even if it is not banned in other countries. And I think that is a huge part of the messaging that's getting lost here. That just because something is legal abroad does not mean that they are eating the same amount of it that we are. And then we should be asking ourselves why. So let's just set the stage. Where do these concerns come from? First, there is the science. Okay, so there is some science. It's not great science. There's nutrition science. We prioritize randomized controlled trials, RCTs. They are rare, right? They're really not the norm. We have to rely on observational studies that produce flawed conclusions. We have to look at patterns. We also have to look at cause and effect. That's really the main difference. In a randomized controlled trial, you are looking at a variable and its effect on an individual. When you are looking at observational studies, you are looking at patterns. When you hear people say things like diets high in fruits and vegetables are linked to decreased risk of depression, that's an observational study. I think there have been actually RCTs done on that subject, but for the most part, when you hear people speak on this, they're looking at observations. Obviously, RCTs are the gold standard in science, but the reality is getting those for nutrition is incredibly hard. Let me give you an example, and I actually wrote about this quite a bit in Dressing on the Side because I think it's a really important point to make. You can find a body of evidence that says low-carb diets are most effective for weight loss. You can also find a large body of evidence that says low-fat diets are the most effective for weight loss. The question is, when you are doing a study in a lab of highly motivated people, it lasts for a specific amount of time, usually no more than a year. What do you think you're going to find, right? You're going to find that both can be effective because both are cultivating fewer calories in, more calories out. It's just that the method, the means by which they're doing that is different. The nutrient that they're manipulating there is different, and that is going to work differently for different people. The question is, does it last? They both can work for weight loss. Do they work for weight loss? Because I define something that works for weight loss as weight loss that becomes weight maintenance over time. And that's the most significant point of all. When it comes to food additives specifically, we are lacking in randomized controlled trials. So that means that a lot of the research that gets thrown out there or that gets talked about is either the research that's been done in test tubes and petri dishes, like basically what's been done in a lab. And then we are looking at what that might mean in animal studies. And when we conduct animal studies, you're basically shooting up a rat with a certain type of food additive to see what is the dose at which that rat croaks or has a specific outcome. That's how we are determining, what a safe limitation might be for a human being. This is very oversimplified for the purpose of this podcast, but just to give you an overview of what this actually looks like. Don't think that that's very applicable to human beings. It's not actually how we live. We don't consume food additives outside of the context of food. So that's just something really important to keep in mind. The other thing we look at is biological plausibility. So a misunderstanding of how substances interact in the body endogenously versus exogenously. So what do we make versus what do we take can result in unfounded fears. Great example of this is our whole confusion about MSG. MSG is actually not considered an artificial food additive by the FDA because it is found naturally in food. Glutamate is found naturally in food. We also make glutamate in the body. You'll hear a lot of food fears expressed about MSG that's been added to food products versus naturally occurring glutamate, but there's no actual research that supports any concern here. But the idea that we make it naturally or that can come naturally from food versus how we perceive something that is not natural, that is man-made, even though it may be man-made from ingredients that are in food, there's still some real concerns despite the fact that there's no actual evidence to support it. There's a lot of unnecessary fear happening when in reality, a lot of things that are around us may require a little bit more attention and a little bit more concern than some of the additives that are coming in that our body produces naturally. Simply that idea can be very difficult for people to get past. And I think we as science communicators, myself included, need to do a better job of talking about it and explaining things in ways that are actually meaningful to people rather than just the ways that we think they should understand it. Also, personal experience. Many people have adverse reactions to food dye. Many people have adverse reactions to lots of things that are found in food. And And yet those things are still permitted in food because we understand that some people may have an intolerance, a specific intolerance, or in some cases, more severe allergy in which the immune system is activated. Now, I think this can often lead individuals to generalize their negative experiences, but I think more important than that is that we need to keep validating, especially practitioners who are listening. It is of utmost importance to validate personal experience. And just so you guys know, in practice, I would never consider the idea of doing anything but. Of course, if someone feels like they have a food allergy or intolerance to a specific type of dye or additive, we're going to do everything we can to find a way for you to eat the foods that you love while avoiding that substance, because it's important that we listen to one another and take our fellow humans seriously. From a public health standpoint, I'm gluten-free. I have celiac disease. I would never expect nor want the food system to become gluten-free as a result of my personal experience, right? Because I know that foods that have gluten in them are highly nutritious, and more often they are the more nutritious alternative versus the gluten-free alternative. Why we have to prioritize people, the 1% of the population, myself included, that cannot tolerate this protein. It doesn't quite make sense to me. Yes, we should have resources and information and food products available to people like me, and we do. It's not quite the same as saying that the entire food system needs to change as a result, because there are certain advantages to food additives. There's also the social influence. So shared beliefs from family and friends, of course, that always plays a role in how we think and feel about food. And it's combined in many cases with a lot of social validation, amplifying concerns, even if it's not supported by science. So the biggest thing that I think is factoring in here, which is institutional mistrust. In a post-COVID world, skepticism has eroded trust in regulatory agencies like the FDA, which fuels major doubts about the adequacy of safety of food additives. Advocacy groups and non-experts are often promoting these fears by emphasizing international bans, even when they're not true, or talking about restrictions without context. Different countries have different priorities based on their own trade and protectionism policies, and therefore saying that a food additive is banned in Japan, it may be because the Japanese themselves did not make that food additive, whereas we made it in the United States. And therefore, Japan is like, we'd like the opportunity to have some innovation of our own on this specific food additive. There's also major limitations with our healthcare systems. Anyone who's listening to this right now knows that. Physicians, healthcare professionals often lack the time, the knowledge to contextualize a patient's individual concerns about additives, which really leads to very dismissive and often conflicting advice. Authority figures expressing caution about food additives can also play a role on the other side, right? That can shape public perception even when the evidence is incomplete. And I think we're seeing this a lot. There's a lot of the truth teller, quote unquote, like from the Casey Meanses of the world and the Marty Macaries of the world, and these individuals who are physicians that are known for one area of expertise or have a background and experience in one specific area of practice, and then are conflating their knowledge and expertise with an understanding of nutrition science, which is just not there, because anyone who has actually looked at this research would not be coming to the conclusion that these substances, these food additives, are definitively harmful for human health in a way that would be meaningfully making a difference based on everyday eating patterns. So I think we got a lot of people out there that are saying certain things are dangerous or scary or worrisome, even if there's no validity there. We underestimate the power of marketing as it relates to food labels. California Prop 65 warning labels are required for chemicals at levels far below safety thresholds, but just seeing California Prop 65 can create undue alarm. Bioengineered food disclosure law, the labeling of bioengineered ingredients, which are not inherently harmful, of course, but they can mislead consumers into associating bioengineered foods with additives or unsafe practices. If there's one food label that I get the most questions about, it's this one, because people see it on their food label, contains bioengineered ingredient. The law, I believe, it's set at 5%. If 5% of a food product comes from a genetically modified or conventionally grown crop, you have to have that disclosure label on your product packaging, which really makes it confusing for consumers who think that they're getting one thing and then go, wait a second, bioengineered, that's scary sounding. I don't want that in my foods. There's a lot of confusion out there. There's really no reason for concern. With California's Prop 65, they are looking at studies that are, again, just done in animals or test tubes. There are no randomized controlled trials about many of these substances, and the limitations that are set by the FDA. So the federal standard for anything that may be considered harmful is 10 times lower than what is shown in mechanistic studies and animal studies to be harmful. So it's already going to be set 10 times lower. So Prop 65 is setting it that much lower in order to do what? How much does that matter? But then you see Prop 65 on a label and you go, well, that's terrifying. What's the rest of the country doing? And as it relates to bioengineered food disclosure law, the person who was really at the forefront of that was Vani Hari, who is the food babe and a huge part of the MAHA movement. And again, what fascinates me about this is the alignment with the Trump transition team and with the incoming administration, when in reality, these people are not political ideologues. These aren't partisans. These are opportunists. These are people with their own companies that could only stand to benefit from some of the MAHA policies being enacted. Still unclear about what those policies actually might look like, but it's an interesting one to watch because this woman was lobbying Bernie Sanders for forever to get that bioengineered ingredients labeling on the map. So really interesting stuff there. It's also media misinformation, clickbait headlines, exaggerating the risk of additives. I'll tell you an interesting story. I hope this is interesting for you guys. In 2017, that's really where I got started into the world of food additives. And it was primarily because of an article that I was asked to write, one of those clickbaity articles, foods banned in other countries but allowed in the US. And after finishing the research on this and really looking into most trending or most topical food additive, I really came to the conclusion that it was astounding how much misinformation was out there, that this was being talked about as though it was a fact when actually it's not a fact, not true at all in many different instances, even when specific ingredients or practices are banned, almost always because of trade-related reasons. And happen to mention this in a setting with some pretty influential folks from the first Trump administration. I got the response that was like, well, we were all involved in trade policy during this time, and so did we make a mistake? And my immediate answer was no. Can one arm of the government trust the other arm? Can the FDA even be trusted? Was basically that what was the subtext of that response. On things like this, I actually feel like the answer is yes. Do I think that we can trust the FDA unilaterally? Absolutely not. We know the answer to that when we look at things like the opioid crisis, right? We know that there are political pressures coming at science from any and every angle. And that institutional mistrust is absolutely earned. I truly believe that. Not at every stage, but some healthy dose of skepticism is warranted because there are always going to be political influences involved in setting specific recommendations. But the end of the story about my own experience writing this article about foods banned in other countries but allowed in the US is that I wound up asking for my name to be removed as the byline. I did not want the byline on this story, even though I had worked really hard on it. And the reason for that was because I felt like, number one, it wasn't true. And number two, to me, it felt kind of anti-American. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you guys feel about that. Those of you who are listening, like, it just felt a little bit like, why are we picking on ourselves so much when actually we know it's not about health? Those of us in the United States who are charged with making policy guidelines, or those abroad, are looking at the same studies. We are all looking at the same research. It's not like the Europeans are smarter and they're looking at studies with, a closer eye. We're all looking at the same research. We're coming to different conclusions because we prioritize different things. Sometimes we come to the same conclusions and that's simply not being stated. We are assuming that politics isn't a thing somehow abroad. There's a lot of very simplistic things that are going into the statement, foods banned in other countries but allowed in the US, that are not being looked at critically or thought about critically. And I think we really need to take another look at the way that this is being expressed. And now the fact that mainstream media is picking up all of this has gone a little bit wild. Let's get into the last point that I want to make on this topic, which is hazard versus risk approach. This is critical. So again, we are all looking at the same research. The EU evaluates food additives based on a hazard approach, whether an ingredient has the potential to cause harm at any level, which leads to more bans and more restrictions. And in the US, we use a risk-based approach, which considers both the potential hazard and the likelihood of exposure at levels deemed unsafe. The last point that I want to make that I think is integral to the entire discussion about and around food additives is that the United States does not have a food culture. Not in the same way that every European country has in its own unique and individual way. Food culture is very much a part of daily life in the EU, and it certainly is in many countries around the world. If I can say this a million times, it will not be enough. we have no food culture, and we have to look at how that is influencing things. I think there are things that we can do to shift food culture, but we cannot regulate culture lest we become the Soviet Union or communist China. We're America. We're not in the habit of regulating culture. And I don't think we should start. If that is the proposal of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the MAHA acolytes, that makes me afraid. First of all, it's very much misaligned with the right side of the political, those of us who are lean to the right or to the center, and frankly, traditional Democrats as well, would not feel comfortable with the idea that we should be regulating everything, including culture. It's a very scary concept, but the way that it's talked about and the way that this gets thrown around a lot is to ignore the fact that if we really wanted things to change, the culture would have to change, and we don't change culture by putting regulations into place. If you go to Italy, the food culture and the experience, the cultural experience there is going to be very different than it is here in the United States. And you can see how food culture at every level of the supply chain is integral to everyday life in many different ways. So I come back to what I said before, which is just because food additives are allowed in these countries does not mean they're consumed regularly. And that's why it all comes back to food culture. The last thing that I want to say about food additives in general is that something that makes them uniquely difficult to speak about is that we do not consume Red 40 by mainlining it. We're not sitting around to drink a cup of Red 40. We are human beings who eat additives in the context of food. When we look at the foods in which food additives are most present, those are going to be ultra-processed packaged foods because they are cheap and because they help to preserve freshness and make foods stay on shelves longer. It's impossible for us as human beings to consume food out. We're not going to sit down and just drink up the MSG and the Red 40 and the seed oil, where no one is sitting down to drink a gallon of seed oil either, right? Like, it's all about the where, the when, the why we are consuming those foods. And if we actually look at where, when, and why we're consuming those foods, that's when the real policy questions start to rise. Next thing that everyone is getting wrong on the topic of MAHA is this big food is poisoning us narrative is a lobbyist agenda and not an evidence-based one. And it's not a reality-based one either. Many of the people who are behind MAHA, we have to remember, are also CEOs of health and wellness tech startups, many of which comprise the lobbying group, otherwise known as End Chronic Disease. This is a coalition that's been led by Callie Means and, again, his sister Casey Means, who are two top Kennedy advisors. All of these people are ones who represent the industry of big wellness. They profit by Americans continuing to believe that big food is the problem and that big pharma is the problem, while they push supplements, protein powders, bars, Bonnie Hari, their continuous glucose monitors, Casey Means, their products and services, like Callie Means, who takes a cut whenever you purchase wellness products through his platform, TrueMed, plus the CEOs of again, Bloom Nutrition is a greens powder company, Higher Dose is red light therapy, and Plunge, which is a cold plunging product. I guess they install the cold plunges. The bottom line is that it matters. It matters a lot because the wellness industry is valued at 1.8 trillion. 1.8 trillion. Okay. The food industry in the United States is valued at 831 billion. And the pharmaceutical industry is valued at 574.4 billion, which means the wellness industry holds a lot more power than either of these two industries. Ultimately, when you think about how much money is being poured into the broad definition of wellness, this is the industry that we have effectively created. And now it's becoming one of those Frankenstein kind of things. It's like, did we even know that we were creating this type of monster? I don't know that these people are bad or nefarious or bad faith actors. Most people, in my experience, are not. All I can tell you is that there's just no evidence to support quite a lot of what these people are saying, the products that they're pushing, the products that they've launched, or the strategies for improving American health that they're often talking about, like removing seed oils from your diet and not buying anything with Red 40 in it. These are not evidence-based strategies. Where they do have a point and where we cannot ignore what they're saying is that the American food system is broken. It is. And if you're listening to this right now and you're about to turn me off because you think I'm going to defend the food industry, I'm not. But at the same time, if you're going to turn this off because you think I'm just going to blame food for our rising healthcare costs, rising rates of chronic disease, and rising obesity prevalence, that's also wrong. I think we need to be able to hold two truths. Again, I've said this before, but I think we need to keep saying it. I think it's important to remember a number of things. And specific to my dietitian friends, to my other healthcare practitioners who are listening to this right now, when someone says big food is poisoning us, and your response is, but social determinants of health, you are not making the point that you think you're making. I know the point you think you're making, and it is a great one, and it is an evidence-based one, and it's an important one that we need to keep talking about. But in the context of that specific scenario, most people are concerned at the consumer level that there is something uniquely poisonous, uniquely toxic, uniquely wrong with American food. So we need to answer this from a chemistry standpoint and not from a biopsychosocial standpoint. I am absolutely and professionally a champion of the free market, and namely finding privately held businesses and privately held strategies to become a larger part of the solution when it comes to improving American health. I think that in many ways, some of the more left-leaning policies have not worked because they are relying on the single most inefficient entity of our time, which is the federal government, to do things that we know could be done in more strategic ways when they're done through the private sector. That's my belief. And it's back to my original question. If you're really invested in American health, wouldn't you want to incentivize companies to profit that are working toward evidence-based solutions versus many of these interventions? That's really what's at the core of this. If making Americans healthier is really at the core of this, then why is no one bringing in people with any preventative health expertise? Why are these people so keen on continuing to seed mistrust in scientists? Simply because, again, I hate to bring her up, simply because Casey Means had a horrible experience in medical school and as a resident at Stanford does not mean that every institution is captured by big food and big pharma. Just because that's unique to Stanford Medical School does not make it so for every single school around the country. And certainly where this really becomes a bee in my bonnet, so to speak, is that for nutrition professionals, we're often labeled as being in the healthcare establishment, and yet we have never aligned with high profit interests of the food industry or the healthcare industry. We are never seen as key stakeholders in either one of those industries, despite the fact that we are the only profession that's actually qualified to give medical nutrition therapy for the prevention and treatment of disease. It's wild. If you were really invested in preventative health, wouldn't you want to empower people like us? Wouldn't you want to empower the private sector to come up with solutions to make neighborhoods safer so that people could get outside more, spend more time outside getting sunlight, getting vitamin D, exercising outside, going for a walk outside? You want to champion mental health companies in the private sector. I'm thinking like BetterHelp. I don't even know if that's a legitimate one. My point being that because telemedicine is on the rise, wouldn't you want to find next solutions that are actually invested in evidence-based treatment for preventative health? Why would we go to the default of things that are not evidence-based? Why is that the default for the MAHA folks? That is the biggest red flag that I can even think of when it comes to this movement, and why I feel the need to even be recording this episode right now. If improved quality of life were really the goal, this group would at least be interested in looking at evidence-based strategies for improving the health and safety of Americans, rather than just screaming on social media that Americans are being poisoned. The Callie Means example all over the podcast universe, talking about how Americans can use pre-tax dollars toward preventative health and wellness solutions under their own HSA, FSA policy, through their own insurance, which he facilitates, but then he profits from it through his company, through TrueMed, right? And in theory, that is great. That's a great thing. But then you look a step further at the companies that are actually aligned with TrueMed. None of it is evidence-based. It's all the cold plunging in the supplements. None of it is how do we get more veggies and fruit onto the plates of everyday Americans. 90% of Americans aren't actually aren't meeting recommendations for veggies and fruit, which we know would be the single most important thing that Americans could do in order to make changes to their health and stay well for good. Why aren't we pushing that? We need to be asking that question, and we need to be asking it every time this topic comes up. It is not an accident that there's no mention of private companies and public health programs that are working to make cities more walkable, that are working to make nutrition solutions like local produce more accessible, or working to help children learn how to cook so that at a very young age, we start to shift food culture and make food culture more a part of the equation, and therefore ultimately cultivate a healthier relationship with food and a greater understanding about where our food comes from. It's really why I have the most trepidation about MAHA and about Kennedy himself and his leadership. Thus far, there's been an effort to actively ignore what we know could work from a scientific standpoint and instead continue to erode faith in the scientific method and evidence-based practitioners. It's shifting public opinion. It's working. And it's shifting public opinion away from people who know the most about preventative health and toward people who only profit from eroding trust. I think we can have both. I think we can have people who profit from making Americans healthier without eroding trust in public health, while also empowering preventative health practitioners. It is worrisome that we're not doing that, and we're actively choosing not to do that. We as Americans, I think, deserve to have both. We already know that produce growers, that CEOs in preventative care, including nutrition and mental health and urban development, exist. So why are none of these people top Kennedy advisors instead? The last topic I think everyone is getting wrong on the topic of MAHA is that the phrase trust the science, asking people to believe in the science here, is actually a rallying cry against the media and against experts like me. And I just don't think it's going to get the job done this time. Look no further than the backlash on X to the New York Times article that debunked all of Robert Kennedy Jr.'s claims. Times' argument was basically, no science here, experts say, without diving into the real how and why and what matters, what doesn't matter, what type of research exists, what doesn't exist, and where personal experience and evidence can often be misaligned. All you'd need to do, New York Times, is to talk to a practitioner. And we can tell you that two things can be true at once. The subhead for this entire episode. Focusing on additives is not seeing the forest from the trees. And I think that entire statement could really be applied to the entire stated MAHA platform at this point. If you replace one additive with another, if you replace one type of cooking oil with another, if you replace one type of chemical pesticide with a quote unquote natural pesticide that also requires treatment of the crops, you are just replacing one thing with another thing. To say that one is better or worse based on whether or not it already existed in nature, it's just simply not true. It's an appeal to nature fallacy. It's just not true. So that's the place where you have the strongest argument, although I know that many people disagree with that. And certainly many people within the MAHA universe certainly disagree with that. To some extent, it's really an economic argument. It's all about trade-offs. It's truly like it comes right back to Thomas Sowell. There are no solutions. There's only trade-offs. In a lot of ways, that is the food industry, the agricultural industry, the pharmaceutical industry at large. What are we willing to take away from in order to invest in chronic disease prevention? Because I do have to say that there's been a lot of talk about Kennedy kind of defunding research around current projects and putting money toward increasing research in prevention. And what strikes me is that high profit interests rarely ever align with preventative health. We know what we need to do in order to live healthier lives. A lot of that is just plain and simple, simply not something that we can turn into a commodity, something that can be made into another thing, another product that is part of why we are shifting toward these influencers from big wellness who are the loudest and most vociferous on this topic. There is a profit to be made if you turn this into a conversation about big wellness versus big pharma, big ag, and big food. Which one is better? There are pros and cons to both. It's not to say that there aren't some major players that could play a huge role in helping Americans get and stay well. It's just a question of who we've empowered to have those voices and who's coming up as a part of this movement and taking the spotlight. The lack of evidence may not matter to American consumers, and it's understandable as to why. And I think knowing that and sharing that here is about as good as we can do. We can just keep talking about it. The more we can talk about why it's not resonating, the more likely we are to come up with new solutions. For those of us who are practicing evidence-based nutrition, using any language that even suggests that people should trust the science will invalidate anything we say. We need to be aware of that. We need to provide the foundation of a convincing argument. And it may not be our fault that we're in this position, but we're here. And we have to accept it, right? Like I have resisted this so much, and I think about this all the time, is that there's a lot of arguments you just can't win with science, even when you want to, even when you know that the most compelling thing in your brain is the actual science or lack thereof that exists on the topic. It comes back to the whole, how do we know who to trust? How do we know what to trust? And where I think a lot of Americans are feeling betrayed is that they're seeing a lot of things, and the food guide pyramid is what led Americans astray, and this is why we are where we are, and it's why we can't trust scientists and we can't trust experts because they told us eggs were bad, and all of these other kind of narratives. The dietary guidelines, by the way, they're the government's cornerstone advice on what to eat and how to eat for better health. And they are corrupted. They are very much corrupted. They are not corrupt because nutrition science is controlled by corporate interests. The language that describes how to apply the dietary guidelines intentionally protects the food industry at the expense of public health. Contrary to the half-truths of MAHA, of RFK Jr., globally, countries are relying on the same foundational science as the United States to shape dietary recommendations. And interestingly, the United States, the EU, the UK, we are all continuing to experience rising rates of chronic disease, with the US leading in cardiovascular disease and obesity, and actually the EU and UK experiencing higher rates of chronic conditions in young people. So would replacing the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee with other people, other individuals who will undoubtedly have some of their own financial conflicts of interest. People have to work for a living. Like, everyone's going to be financially conflicted in some way, especially those of us in the scientific community who are probably like feeling all kinds of ways about it. I have accepted money from big food companies mostly to give my own opinion in that room, to give my experience and clinical opinion on a specific subject or a specific topic, or to speak on a specific topic. And not really sure why, we've let this narrative of like their financial conflicts of interest are what matters most, when most of the time you're basically just trying to rack your brain thinking about any company you've ever worked with because you want to be as transparent as possible. And what those who are listening right now should know, if for any health professional, if you have a credential after your name that is a credible credential after your name, you have to provide your financial conflicts when you go and speak or do anything, anywhere. Anything that is going to be in the public health sphere, anytime you are doing an industry related event, anytime you are speaking somewhere, you have to provide all of your financial disclosures. When you are the CEO of a wellness company, you never have to do that. The real problem that is shielding the food industry from market pressure and leaving consumers, to the extent that they're even reading the dietary guidelines, which we'll talk about in a minute, is profoundly confused. Okay, so when the dietary guidelines recommend what to eat, they name broad categories of foods like vegetables, fruit, whole grains. When they advise you on what to limit, they shift the language to abstract terms. They name nutrients, limit added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium. This avoids direct mention of the specific food products that are most responsible for these components in the American diet. This deliberate framing creates profitable loopholes for industry. So food companies are spared market pressure from having their products explicitly named. What happens is that they can continue marketing healthier alternatives without making actually meaningful changes to their formulations. It's one of the core reasons, in my opinion, why Americans are so confused about nutrition in the first place. It has nothing to do with the eggs or no eggs, okay? It is all about the fact that we know that saturated fat, sodium, and added sugar are the three nutrients that are overconsumed in the United States. And when they are overconsumed, they are directly implicated in increasing our risk of chronic disease. The question is, why aren't we naming the foods? Instead of saying limit added sugars, what if we said limit sugar sweetened beverages? You see how that affects Pepsi and Coke, right? Doesn't that seem like it could directly affect the bottom line of industry right there, just of soda companies? So that is where we have a huge problem with dietary guidelines. That is what makes them hugely corrupt. There's also a tremendous amount of time that is like the public comment period where lobbyists from these organizations, from these companies, come in and actually influence the guidelines and persuade them to be written in a specific way. Also, why the writing of them matters so much and why this has historically never changed. Because we can talk about the conflicts of interest of the committee all we want, but if they're always going to be written this way, and if we're just going to follow that methodology and just continue to believe that that can't change, then we're never going to make any improvements to this document. Now, here's the thing that I have to mention. Less than 10% of Americans are following the dietary guidelines to begin with, which is a glaring indicator of their failure to resonate in the first place. But this document isn't really for consumers. This document is guidance for industry effectively. It says it's dietary guidelines for Americans, but it winds up being guidance for industry. If RFK really wants to restore trust in the dietary guidelines, the solution is not to appoint new advisory committee members from other areas of industry, like with other industry ties. It might sound great in theory, but eliminating bias entirely from any human being is actually impossible. We know this. Right? We know that this isn't possible. There's no guarantee that quote unquote decoupling evidence-based guidelines from corporate capture won't simply swap one industry's influence, like big food, for another, big wellness. Can you even imagine if we had Vani Hari making the nutrition guidelines for Americans? Meanwhile, it's not a food pyramid. We haven't had a food pyramid since 2011. So even just hearing this like really makes my skin crawl. But now I'm like, I've talked about it so much. I'm starting to use their own language. I'm worried about me. It's called My Plate. Check it out. Okay. Because I think that any reasonable person, no matter where you stand on the Kennedy nomination for health secretary, no matter where you stand politically, you will look at My Plate and think, what's wrong with this? It's very inoffensive. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. If we actually followed those guidelines, Americans would be so much healthier. The question is, why aren't we following them? The question is, why are these so unknown and not, relevant to consumers' everyday lives? When the executive summary and the key findings are written, limit added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium should be right away naming and shaming the foods that are highest in these nutrients if we really wanted to cultivate transparency and we really wanted to make Americans healthier. Why is RFK not talking about that? Just asking questions, right? Why is he not talking about that? All right. Would the dietary guidelines make a difference to everyday Americans if they changed? I personally think they would, but not in a direct way. I do not think it would be that direct way. I think it would have to do with the shifts that are made by industry to actually prioritize American health. And I want to make sure that we get into all of that and some ideas for and ways to prioritize American health in the rest of this series and in future episodes. I'm going to leave it here for now. If the groundswell of support is any indicator, there is interest here. And if there is any way that practitioners like me, that dietitians like me can find our way into helping to influence policy more focused on science, regardless of politics, the more successful we can become. I got into this profession because I want to help people. Most of us did. Most healthcare practitioners got into their profession because they want to help people. We also, though, need to live and we need to make money in order to live. And so how can we do both in a way that's meaningful without saying that one large industry should profit over another? My main question at the beginning of this, who should profit from Americans getting healthier? How can we reform the food and healthcare systems in order to make it so that profitability comes by helping our neighbors? That's something I'm going to be thinking about. Reach out to me with questions. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I can't wait to hear what you think about this new series, and I will see you next time. Thanks so much for listening to The Business of Wellness. I'm your host and executive producer, Jaclyn London. Remember that advice provided on this podcast is based on my application of research and practice as a registered dietitian and should not replace medical advice provided by your physician. If you like what you're listening to, please follow the show, leave a 5-star rating, and share something you loved from today's episode by leaving a review. This podcast only grows with your support. So if you enjoyed this episode, share it far and wide. It may be the one thing someone needs to hear to start building that roadmap today to secure a healthier, happier future. That's it for now. So until next time, cheers.